She was 22 years old, and the town of Harrow's Bend had already decided what she was. Not with any single pronouncement, not with any formal verdict read aloud in the square, but in the slow, cumulative way that small places render judgment on those who don't fit the shape of things. They decided it in the way men stopped talking when she walked into the feed store, in the way women pulled their children slightly closer as she passed on the boardwalk, in the way Bishop Garrett's wife referred to her always as that Calloway girl, with a pause before the word that carried the weight of everything they thought she should be ashamed of. Her name was Nora Calloway, and she was not ashamed. She had come to Harrow's Bend 3 years earlier as the wife of a man named Thomas Calloway, a carpenter from Colorado who had convinced her with warm eyes and warmer promises that the Wyoming territory was where a person could build something real. He had not been wrong about the land. He had been catastrophically wrong about himself. Thomas Calloway drank with the dedication of a man pursuing a second profession, and when the whiskey took him fully, as it did on a cold Thursday in March, he walked out the front door of their small house on the edge of town and did not come back. No body was ever found, no note was ever left. He was simply gone, the way a candle goes out, leaving only the smell of smoke and the dark. What he left behind was a house with a lion against it, a mule named Pepper who was old and stubborn, and the single most reliable creature Nora had ever known, and a reputation as a woman who had been left. In a territory town in 1883, being left was a kind of verdict in itself. It implied a deficiency in the woman, a failure to hold, to keep, to manage. Nobody said it plainly, they rarely do, but it was understood. She kept the house by taking in sewing, by selling eggs from the 6 hens she kept behind the kitchen, and by doing the kind of quiet, invisible labor that sustains households and receives no name. She mended harness leather for the liveryman, fixed the schoolteacher's broken chair with a joint tighter than the original, and twice hauled firewood from the foothills for old Hendrik Maas, who was past the age of doing it himself. She did not ask for sympathy or credit. She kept her accounts with herself and let the town think what it liked. Her one advantage, and she knew it clearly, was her father. Not his presence. He had been dead since she was 14, killed by a horse that slipped on an icy creek crossing, but his teaching. Elias Prentice had been a practical man of exceptional range. He could read a watershed like a text, build a sound structure from green timber, and preserve food enough to last a high-altitude winter from what a summer garden produced. He had no sons, and he made no apology for teaching his only daughter everything he would have taught them. Nora carried that education in her hands and her eyes, in the habit of looking at broken or abandoned things and seeing not what they were, but what they could become. That was what she saw when she first found the wagon. It was late September when she came across it, following the dry creek bed south of town, where she sometimes gathered the bitter, wild rose hips that made a good tea and a better cold remedy. The Laramie breaks cut through that country in long, jagged shelves of pale limestone, and the creek bed wound between them before dropping sharply into a narrow, cut canyon the locals called Vessel's Draw, after a trapper named Vessel, who had fallen into it in 1849 and walked out 3 days later with a broken wrist and a changed disposition. The wagon was at the bottom of the draw, tipped on its side against a ledge of stone. It had clearly fallen from the trail above, the very trail that connected Harrow's Bend to the southern ranch country. One look at the drop told her the fall had been hard and fast. The tongue was sheared entirely, both left wheels collapsed inward, and the canvas bows were bent and tangled like the ribs of some enormous, exhausted animal. A freight wagon, large gauge, with iron tires she could see even from above, was still seated solid on the remaining wheels. She stood on the rim and looked down for a long time. She went home that evening and said nothing to anyone. She went back the next morning with Pepper and a coil of rope, and spent 3 hours at the canyon rim running calculations in her head that her father had first taught her when she was 9 years old, using a fence post and a creek stone. Mechanical advantage, anchor points, the geometry of a block and tackle rigged from what the landscape offered. She noted the placement of a thick-trunked cedar 20 feet back from the edge, its roots visible in the limestone and deep enough to hold a house. She noted a natural notch in the rock at the rim's edge that would serve as a redirect point for rope. She walked the draw floor where she could access it from the east, measuring the grade with her eyes and the steadiness of her own stride. She spent 2 days gathering what she needed. She bought rope from the hardware store, the good Manila hemp, 60 feet of it, and 2 pulleys from the same. The hardware man, Geddes, looked at her purchase and looked at her and said nothing, which in Harrow's Bend meant everything. She fashioned a capstan from a length of pine she had in the woodpile at home, spending an evening shaping it by firelight with a draw knife, the wood curling away from the blade in smooth, pale ribbons. She began the work on a Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, she had her first audience. It started with 2 boys on horseback who stopped on the rim trail to watch, and it grew from there with the reliable magnetism of any spectacle. By Thursday, when the wagon had moved perhaps 12 feet up the grade, and the canyon walls had begun to ring regularly with the sound of the rope straining in the pulleys and Nora's low, constant commands to Pepper, there were 6 men watching from the rim. One of them was Geddes from the hardware. One was a rancher named Cole Prentice, no relation, a broad man with a face like a badly tanned hide. One was the deputy, Ira Polk, who had no particular reason to be there except that he had nothing better to do. Cole Prentice was the first to speak loudly enough to be heard at the canyon floor. "That wagon's been down there since July," he called down. "Breckman outfit lost it coming back from Cheyenne. They wrote it off. You think you're going to haul it out by yourself?" Nora did not look up. She was resetting her anchor, driving the stake she had fashioned from a wagon spoke deeper into the packed earth with 3 clean, deliberate blows of a stone maul. "Who even told her she could do that?" someone else said, though whether it was addressed to her or to the men beside him was unclear. "Nobody has to tell her," Geddes said quietly, and the rim fell briefly silent. But quietly was not the register the others maintained. Through Thursday afternoon and into Friday morning, the commentary continued in the easy, careless way of men who have nothing at stake and therefore nothing to lose by being wrong. It was foolish work for a woman alone. The wagon was ruined beyond any use. She would hurt herself, or the old mule, or both. Why she didn't just leave it for the spring thaw and the salvagers who came through then was beyond any reasonable person's understanding. Nora worked. The canyon was cold in the mornings, the limestone holding the night's chill long after the sun had reached the rim. Her breath came in long, visible plumes. Her hands, wrapped in leather work gloves, knew the rope so well by Friday afternoon that she could feel the load distribution change in the fibers before the system adjusted. She talked to Pepper in a low, steady voice, the same tone her father had used with horses, a tone that carried no urgency and therefore no fear. The mule's ears moved with each word, rotating toward her like small, patient receivers. On Friday evening, with the sun dropping behind the western breaks and the limestone going from pale gold to a deep, bruised amber, the wagon cleared the rim. It came over the edge with a final, shuddering groan, the iron tires biting into the dirt, the remaining wheels turning for the first time in 3 months with a sound like a slow, reluctant exhalation. Nora stood with her hands on her knees for a long moment, breathing hard, the sweat cooling fast in the evening air. The men on the rim were quiet. She straightened up, pushed her hair back from her face, and looked at the wagon. It was worse than it had appeared from above. The left side was badly staved in, 2 sideboards cracked through, the hub of the near wheel cracked but not shattered. The tongue was gone entirely. But the frame, the deep, cross-braced running gear of heavy oak and iron, was sound. She could see it clearly now in the last of the day's light. Sound. The iron tires were good. The box, damaged but not destroyed, was built from boards nearly 2 inches thick. Whoever had ordered this wagon had ordered it for work, not appearance, and that honesty of construction had outlasted the accident that ended it. She unhitched Pepper, fed him a handful of oats from her coat pocket, and began covering the wagon with the canvas tarp she had brought for this purpose. Cole Prentice rode over, his horse stopping 5 feet from her. "What do you want with it?" he asked. Not mockingly now, genuinely. She tucked the edge of the canvas under the wagon frame and straightened. "Shelter," she said. He looked at the wreck and looked at her and seemed to find no adequate response to that. He turned his horse and rode back toward town. What nobody in Harrow's Bend understood, what they could not see from the rim with their easy judgments and their incurious eyes, was that Nora Calloway was not looking at a damaged wagon. She was looking at the winter, which was 6 weeks away, and she was looking at the walls of her house, which was single-thickness pine board with no insulation whatsoever, and she was looking at the price of seasoned lumber at Geddis's yard, which was more than she had, and she was making a calculation that had nothing abstract about it at all. She was going to survive the winter, and this wagon was going to help her do it. What she could not have known, as she walked home through the early dark, with Pepper's reins loose in her hand, was that beneath the splintered boards of that wagon's false floor, the carpenter who had built it had left something behind. Something that had nothing to do with freight or lumber or the cold practicalities of survival. Something that would not only change Nora Calloway's winter, but change the entire shape of what her life could become. Drop your location in the comments and tell us where you're watching from tonight. The false floor revealed itself on a Saturday morning. Nora had begun the careful work of stripping usable lumber from the wagon, starting with the sideboards, prying each plank free with a nail bar, and stacking them by length against the side of her woodshed. She worked methodically, the way her father had taught her, taking stock before taking action, knowing what each piece was and where it would go before she pulled it loose. The thick floor planks were the prize, destined for the interior walls of her house, where they would be fitted against the existing boards with a gap of packed grass insulation between them, a technique her father had used in his mountain cabin and which kept the place livable at 30 below. She was tapping along the floor with the handle of her nail bar, checking for soft spots, when she heard the difference. A section near the front, perhaps 4 feet by 3, returned a hollow knock instead of the flat, dense thud of solid timber. She crouched, running her fingers along the seams, and found the workmanship immediately. The joinery was too fine, the spacing too precise. This was not cargo flooring. This was cabinetry, done by a man who understood that concealment and function were the same thing if you were skilled enough. She found the catch under the forward edge, a small iron button flush with the wood, and when she pressed it, the panel lifted free with the soft, certain movement of something built to last. Inside, nested in a bed of clean straw that still held a faint sweetness, were 3 things. The first was a leather roll, the kind a craftsman uses for tools, tied with a cord. She unrolled it on the wagon's tailgate and found inside a set of woodworking instruments of extraordinary quality. Chisels ground to a mirror edge, a marking gauge of rosewood and brass, a small block plane whose iron, when she tested it against her thumb, was sharp enough to shave. They were a working craftsman's finest tools, the ones he would have kept separate from his everyday kit, the ones he would not have wanted damaged or lost. The second was a tin box, latched but not locked. Inside were $47 in paper currency and coin, a modest fortune by Harrow's Bend standards, and a pocket watch whose case was engraved on the back with the initials EWB and the date 1871. The third was a letter. It was addressed to no one. It began simply, "If you found this, then I did not." She sat down on the cold ground and read it. The man's name was Edwin Breckman. He was the younger brother of the man who had commissioned the wagon, Heinrich Breckman, the rancher who had written the whole thing off after the accident in July. Edwin had been the driver. He had built the false floor himself over 2 evenings in a livery stable in Cheyenne because he was carrying something he didn't trust his brother to handle fairly. The letter explained it with the careful, pained clarity of a man settling accounts he expected never to collect in person. Heinrich Breckmann owed wages to 11 men who had worked the summer drive. He had been putting off payment for 6 weeks, citing cash flow, citing the cost of the drive, citing everything except the simple fact that he was a man who paid his debts last and his resentments first. Edwin had taken the wages in cash from the ranch strongbox before leaving Cheyenne. $47 was his own money, he wrote, for whoever found this and had use of it. But there was more. Underneath the letter, wrapped separately in oilcloth, was a folded document, a promissory note signed by Heinrich Breckmann and witnessed by 2 named men in Cheyenne, acknowledging a debt of $230 owed to the men of the summer drive, with the ranch's south pasture acreage listed as collateral. Edwin Breckmann had died in the accident. His body had been found half a mile downstream in July and buried quietly by his brother, who had told no one about the wages, filed no claim on the promissory note, and written to the men of the drive that the cash had been lost in the fall. Which it had been. He simply hadn't mentioned that he knew where. Nora read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully, put it back in the tin, and sat very still in the cold morning air for a long time. She knew Heinrich Breckmann by sight and by reputation. He ran 300 head on the bench country south of town, and he had a long memory for slights and a short one for obligations. He had not been kind to her when Thomas left. He had been the one to suggest, loudly and publicly at the feed store, that a woman in her position would do better to move on to a town more suited to charity cases. She had said nothing at the time. She had been too tired and too new to her solitude to fight. She thought about what her father would have done. She thought about the 11 men, their names listed in the letter in Edwin's neat, even hand. Men scattered across the territory who had worked a full summer on Breckmann's word and received nothing for it. She thought about the winter, which was now 5 weeks away, and which she was substantially better equipped to face because of $47 and a wagon load of good timber. She made her decisions in the order her father had always prescribed. First, what is right. Second, what is necessary. Third, what is possible given the first 2. She went to see Marshal Cord. He was a different kind of lawman than she had expected. Not young, not eager, not particularly impressed by anything, but possessed of a quality she recognized immediately because her father had had it too. He listened. He listened to all of it without interrupting, his eyes on the letter and the promissory note spread across his desk, and when she finished, he looked up at her with an expression that was not surprise, but assessment. "You understand," he said, "that Breckmann will say his brother took that money without authorization." "The promissory note is signed and witnessed," Nora said. "The debt is real regardless of who carried the money." The marshal looked at her for a moment. "You've thought this through." "I've had a quiet morning." He almost smiled. He folded the documents, put them in his breast pocket, and reached for his hat. The confrontation with Heinrich Breckmann was not dramatic in the way of stories that want to be exciting. It was a room with 3 people in it, the marshal, Breckmann, and Nora, and a set of documents that said plainly what had happened, and a man who knew that the witnesses in Cheyenne were real men who would testify to what they had signed. The ranch's south pasture was not seized. Breckmann was not arrested. What happened was quieter and in some ways more complete. He paid. He paid in full, the $230, in the presence of the marshal, and the 11 men received their wages through the territorial post, Nora having written each of their addresses from Edwin's letter with the marshal's help to locate them. It took 3 weeks. Every one of them was found. The $47 she kept, as the letter had intended. She used it with the precision of a woman who has learned to make small things count. A winter's worth of lamp oil, enough flour and dried beans and salt pork to see her through until March without anxiety. 2 windows of real glass for the south wall of her house, where the thick new lumber she had salvaged from the wagon now stood as interior insulation. The gap between old wall and new, packed with dry grass and cattail fluff from the creek bottom. She hung curtains she had sewn herself from flour sacking, and on the first genuinely cold night of October, she lit her lamp and sat at her table in a house that held its warmth like a cupped hand holds water. Outside, the temperature dropped to 12 degrees. The wind came off the brakes in long, uninterrupted sweeps that rattled every ill-fitted window in Harrow's Bend. She heard later that Cole Prentice had lost 2 calves that first cold snap. She heard that the schoolteacher had moved her bed next to the stove and still woke to frost on the inside of her windows. Nora's house was warm. Word moved through the town the way it always does in a small place, not as announcement, but as accumulation. People noticed that her lamp burned at a regular hour every evening and not all night, which meant she was not burning extra fuel to compensate for a cold house. People noticed that she moved without the hunched urgency of someone rationing warmth. Geddes mentioned to the rancher beside him at the feed store counter that he had sold her the insulation lumber himself, and that the way she had described using it was not a method he had seen before, but that it made solid sense. Cole Prentice said nothing for a long while, and then said she had more sense than most, and left it at that. She was not celebrated, she was not thanked, but something changed in the way the town held her, the way a hand relaxes around something it has been gripping too tightly. She was no longer the woman who had been left. She was the woman who had dragged that wagon out of the canyon. By midwinter, 3 people had asked her to look at their houses and tell them what she would do. She charged a fair rate for the consultation, $1.50, and she was worth it twice over. By spring, she had been asked to oversee the insulation of the new schoolhouse, a job she quoted honestly and completed ahead of schedule with 1 hired hand and Pepper's reliable assistance. She was 22 years old, and the town of Harrow's Bend had changed its verdict. Not with ceremony, not with apology, in the way that small places sometimes do, quietly and without fanfare, when the evidence has become too solid to ignore, and the winter has proved, without argument or appeal, who was right. She still had the tools from Edwin Breckman's roll. She kept them clean and sharp, the way a good craftsman would have. On the coldest nights, when the wind ran hard off the Laramie brakes and the lamp burned steady in her warm, solid house, she sometimes took out the pocket watch with the initials EWB and turned it over in her hands. He had been a man who built things well and tried to do what was right, and had not survived to see it matter. She thought of him when she worked. She thought that was the least she could do. What have you found value in that others had already written off? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one.